Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the not that new anymore album from DJ Sabrina the Teenage DJ, Charmed. Okay, a little late to this one. This was a project that drops near the end of last year, but I did actually manage to hear just before the end of 2020 since several of my music critic peers were giving huge ups to it. Especially Ryan from Not Real Music and David Rowe, who both had the project very high up on their respective year-end lists. The latter even did an entire one-take video of him dancing to the full 3-hour length of the album. Shout out to David Rowe, he's doing good stuff. I wasn't totally sure if I wanted to do a proper video on it myself, especially after seeing Fantano's video the other day, which, while I am going to be markedly more positive towards this project than he was, I do also agree with a lot of his points. But after his video got me to just re-listen to the whole thing, and I wrote down all my thoughts for a possible segment on Some Stuff I Missed Volume 5, I ended up with enough to save to fill up a proper video, so I guess here we are anyway. So yes, this album is a gigantic, sprawling, 3-hour future funk and house sort of project. Lots of plunderphonic disco grooves and house grooves and anything like that, so long as it can help deliver that sense of nostalgia for the 90s and early 2000s. Lots of stuff in the same vein as, like, The Avalanches or Saint Pepsi at their peaks. I haven't heard any of DJ Sabrina's other albums outside of this one. I'm assuming they largely sound the same, albeit with less refined production. The whole DJ Sabrina the Teenage DJ project, not just limited to this particular album, is obviously directly inspired by the show Sabrina the Teenage Witch, which I've never actually seen, but I was still reminded of other similar shows from when I was a kid, like Wizards of Waverly Place, that my dozens of female cousins were into back in the old days. It's certainly an interesting aesthetic to be basing your entire project on, and a pretty funny stage name to boot. A lot of people have told me that they were able to get through this entire 3-hour project in one sitting and come out fulfilled, that they never got sick of the sound of everything. And you know what, I definitely get that perspective. All 31 tracks here are really well produced and mastered for what they are. I could take any single one of them out of context and they would bop just as well as any other, even in spite of many of these tracks themselves often stretching on for 7, 8, 9, 11, 13, 14 minutes. Some of those lengths are justified, but some of them are not. And yeah, 3 hours of this stuff all at once was obviously way too freaking much for me, and the sound would get stale. Even if I did it in multiple sittings, which I couldn't actually go through the whole thing in one unbroken go. I always needed at least 2 breaks. I feel like I'd much rather just, like, pick and choose a handful of favorite tracks instead of digesting the whole thing. But this album isn't as well suited to skipping around as I'd hope either, given that every track really cleanly transitions into the next. It's really solidly constructed continuous mix that nailed pretty much every segue between each track, so it is a real shame that I feel more strongly compelled to break it up. In terms of individual moments, if you look at a track like Next to Me, that's a pretty solid opener that does a pretty good job of setting the tone and aesthetic of the album, has a pretty neat progression from sounding like this basic 80s sitcom soundtrack to just intensifying itself and adding more and more layers of Disney Channel dance grooves as you go on. But most of the other tracks on here pull the same kinds of tricks that this opener does. I don't even think this is necessarily among the most compelling moments on this thing. Like, I don't know if it's one of my biggest favorites. I mean, you got the title track shortly after that, which has the same sort of progression, but has a way better and more memorable hook, despite some low-key male R&B spoken word-ish vocals that didn't really add much to the experience. It never got distracting. Do, love it way I do. And most of the other tracks sound kind of like that opener and are structured in a similar way. Not to say there's no variety at all for the rest of the project. There's a lot of like quick interludes like By the Pool or After the Fall. It can often feel like some of those transitional moments on the Avalanche's first 2 albums, which were great for that bit of extra flavor, tried to give the album some sense of environment. But those stop showing up beyond the first half hour, and some of the subsequent interludes like This Is the Remix feel a little pointless. Even some of the longer tracks later on have these cheesy dialogue snippets presumably pulled from the actual show that, wasn't a really big fan of those either. There are tracks like Too Long Looking Back with its 2000s boy band harmonies, which sounded different enough from everything else to feel refreshing, as well as its more fast-paced sequel with somewhat annoying bass lines and weaker vocals. Maybe you got a track like Forever, which sounds like some kind of 80s electro and early hip-hop type of cut, blending into cheesy early 90s pop rock, or the punchy, if weirdly off-putting synth pop of Strayed Ocean, or the almost Green Day-esque vocals on Alrighty Then, and the alternating Muzaki ambience and teeny bopper rock of A, which got pretty cringeworthy in many moments, especially its first 2 minutes or so. Tracks like these do add more flavor and variety, and they do help the pacing, but none of them feel like particular keepers in their own right for me. In terms of actual highlights, I really liked Love Foundation, which also felt a bit maybe Wildflowerish, but with much more commercial polish. Also has a really solid hook. Love Foundation. The synthwave-esque grooves of Nyakuza Metro Cats, and the way they went over all the punchy horn sections and slap bass was plenty of fun despite the corny title. I really love the way that they transition into all the beautiful cascades of Rhodes pianos and synth harps on Feel the Pain 1. Really nice to have a more chill moment like this track, and that was a real stunner. And that contrast makes a track like I Want You to Know feel like it's just exploding like fireworks. Somehow the groove on that one never got stale over 9 minutes. And that led into New Year's Resolution, which sounds like some kind of delightful 90s slice of life anime theme song translated into English, going over some synthwave E-beats. Even if you could have shaved off a few minutes, still, that whole run of 4 tracks was probably my favorite stretch of tracks in the whole project. All great stuff, but beyond that point, there's not much in the way of outright clunkers, but not much in the way of, like, huge standouts either. It's all enjoyable, but not the most attention-grabbing, and all kind of running together. The next properly great moment for me wasn't until Just Reminds Me That We're All Alone, which has some great punchy percussion and sample manipulations that really resonated with me. Even multiple violin solos for that extra cherry on top to make it stand out. Wedding Night banged pretty effectively without feeling stale. Right Now combined jazzy electric pianos with some Faithless-esque mumbled spoken word, and some punchy orchestral samples and Robin S. style bass lines. And the album's closer, End of an Era, is excellent as well. Love the pianos on this one, and the mix of soul singer samples and lounge jazz vibes made for a dramatic but toned down finish that really stuck the landing in a satisfying way in spite of being weighed down by the crushing lengths of the rest of the album, as well as being 13 minutes long in its own right. It really does make good use of that length. There's other parts which are just okay to me. Still Cool has some badass sax solos despite not having one of the better hooks. How Did You Know has a much better hook, despite taking a long time to actually hook me in. Not Your Fault is pretty cute and heartfelt and comforting, as was Down With Love, despite getting a bit repetitive and drawn out. But on the other hand, speaking of drawn out, there are also a bunch of tracks near the end that really get dragged out way too long for their own good. See the 9-minute Nothing's Gonna Stand in My Way, the 11-minute My Baby I Become Unhinged, and especially the 14-minute Charmed Life. Tracks like these can really feel like a meandering chore to get through, especially after being weighed down by so many other tracks that do these kinds of sounds better. I feel like there's a really great album in here if I were just to edit it down to like an hour to 70 minutes of just my personal favorite material. Like, for my iPod, I've kept the track listing down to just these 10 tracks, and that was enough for me, despite there being plenty more good to great material that I've omitted. Cutting it down made for a much more fulfilling and replayable listen for me. Listening to the full package feels like I'm doing a full series binge of an old Disney Channel show, sitcom or otherwise, that has plenty of great episodes that somehow hold up in spite of their datedness, but plenty of other filler episodes that are just formulaic and blah. And it's also one of those shows where everything has to return to the status quo at the end of every episode and there's no actual overarching plot. It's really frustrating because if not for the crushing length and the overabundance of redundant tracks, this could have been a big last-minute favorite of last year. The craft and production and even the actual DJing is top-notch even in its worst moments. And the best moments are absolutely stellar and feel like I'm just transcending into another dimension of disco and house. I guess I'll say at the end of the day, it is worth giving a shot if you're curious. Take the plunge for one listen and then pick and choose favorites to keep around for longer term listening. And which ones will really work for you could be totally different from mine. Like a few of the tracks that were really big favorites of mine, I didn't see a lot of other people highlight as their favorites as well, so that's probably a good sign. Or maybe you'll just want to keep around the whole thing, who knows. Whatever the case, DJ Sabrina definitely has my attention at this point. If she can put out a project as well crafted as this, but with the fat trimmed down to a more approachable length, that could be something really special. The way it is, it's certainly impressive and commendable that I came out as satisfied as I was, but it's still only good and not great as a whole to me. So, I'm overall feeling like a 7.3 out of 10 on this. It's worth a shot. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.